Millionaire woman marries homeless man she met in park 1 week later. He vanishes, leaves note. The autumn rain had stopped just as sunset painted the sky above Central Park in shades of amber and rose, creating the perfect backdrop for what would become the most important encounter of Sarah Mitchell's life. At 35, Sarah commanded a tech empire worth over $600 million. Her revolutionary cybersecurity software protecting governments and corporations worldwide. Yet as she sat alone on a weathered park bench, watching joggers and dog walkers navigate the damp pathways, she felt more isolated than she had ever felt in her corner office overlooking Manhattan's financial district. Sarah's decision to walk through the park that evening had been impulsive, born from a desperate need to escape the suffocating world of board meetings, investor presentations, and carefully orchestrated social events that filled her days. Her penthouse apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and museum-quality art collection, had begun to feel like a gilded prison where authentic human connection seemed impossible to find. The past year had been particularly challenging for Sarah's personal life. A string of relationships with successful, wealthy men had ended in disappointment when she realized that each partner was more interested in her fortune than in her as a person. The loneliness of being valued primarily for her net worth had become unbearable, leading to increasingly frequent escapes to places where she could be anonymous and unrecognized. As twilight deepened over the park, Sarah noticed a figure sitting beneath a large oak tree about 50 yards away. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, his clothing worn but clean, his posture suggesting someone lost in deep contemplation. Something about his stillness amid the park's gentle evening activity drew her attention and held it with an intensity that surprised her. Thomas Anderson had been living in Central Park for nearly 3 months, having arrived in New York with nothing but the clothes on his back and a past he was desperately trying to forget. His makeshift shelter was hidden among the dense bushes near the reservoir, carefully constructed to be invisible to both park authorities and other homeless individuals who might view him as competition for resources. Unlike many of the homeless individuals Sarah had observed during her previous walks, Thomas carried himself with a dignity that seemed untouched by his circumstances. He was reading a book, an actual paperback novel, rather than a newspaper or magazine, found in trash bins, and his complete absorption in the text suggested someone for whom reading was a pleasure, rather than merely a way to pass time. Sarah found herself studying Thomas with growing curiosity. His facial features spoke of intelligence and sensitivity, while his careful attention to personal hygiene, despite his obvious lack of permanent housing, suggested someone who had not given up on himself despite difficult circumstances. There was something almost aristocratic about his bearing, as if homelessness was a temporary condition rather than a permanent identity. The connection between them began when Thomas looked up from his book and caught Sarah staring at him. Rather than the aggressive confrontation or desperate plea for money that she had come to expect from such encounters, Thomas simply smiled, a warm, genuine expression that seemed to acknowledge their shared humanity without any ulterior motive. Sarah surprised herself by approaching Thomas, drawn by an impulse she couldn't fully explain. Their first conversation lasted until the park lights came on, covering topics that ranged from literature to philosophy to their observations about the city's rhythms and personalities. Thomas spoke with the educated vocabulary and thoughtful insights of someone who had clearly received excellent education, though he offered no explanation for his current circumstances. What struck Sarah most powerfully about Thomas was his complete lack of interest in her wealth or status. He treated her simply as an interesting person whose thoughts and opinions merited serious consideration. For the first time in years, Sarah felt valued for her mind, her character, and her perspective rather than her bank account or business achievements. Their evening conversations became a daily ritual that Sarah found herself anticipating with growing excitement. She would finish her work responsibilities as quickly as possible, change into casual clothes that wouldn't attract attention, and hurry to the park where Thomas would be waiting with a new book or an interesting observation about the day's events. Through these conversations, Sarah learned fragments of Thomas's story. He had been a professor of literature at a prestigious university, had lost his position during a scandal he preferred not to discuss, and had subsequently lost his home, his savings, and his family relationships. His choice to disappear into homelessness had been deliberate, a form of self-imposed exile that allowed him to escape the consequences of whatever mistakes had destroyed his previous life. Thomas's perspective on wealth, success, and happiness challenged many of Sarah's fundamental assumptions about what made life meaningful. His contentment with simple pleasures, a good book, a beautiful sunset, an interesting conversation revealed to Sarah how much of her own happiness had been tied to external validation and material accumulation rather than genuine fulfillment. After 2 weeks of evening conversations, Sarah realized she was falling in love with Thomas in a way that felt entirely different from her previous relationships. Her feelings were based on genuine admiration for his character, his intelligence, and his philosophical approach to adversity, rather than any strategic considerations about mutual benefit or social compatibility. The turning point came during a particularly cold October evening when Sarah arrived at the park to find Thomas shivering despite his attempts to maintain his usual composure. Without hesitation, she invited him to her apartment, an offer that represented both practical compassion and emotional vulnerability that surprised them both. Thomas's first night in Sarah's penthouse was a revelation for both of them. He moved through her luxurious space with appreciation but without awe, treating her art collection and expensive furnishings as beautiful objects rather than symbols of status or power. His lack of overwhelm or obvious gratitude suggested someone who had once been accustomed to similar luxury but had learned to live without it. Their physical relationship developed naturally from the emotional intimacy they had already established. Thomas's approach to lovemaking was gentle, thoughtful, and completely focused on Sarah's pleasure and comfort rather than his own satisfaction. His tenderness revealed someone who understood that true intimacy was about emotional connection rather than physical conquest. The week that followed was the happiest period of Sarah's adult life. Thomas brought a sense of peace and authenticity to her daily routine that she had never experienced. His presence transformed her sterile penthouse into a warm home filled with laughter, deep conversations, and the simple pleasure of sharing meals and quiet moments with someone who valued her company above everything else. Thomas's impact on Sarah's perspective was profound. His appreciation for small pleasures helped her rediscover joy in things she had taken for granted: the taste of morning coffee, the play of light through her windows, the satisfaction of reading a good book without any business purpose. His philosophical approach to money and success challenged her to reconsider her relationship with wealth and achievement. The marriage proposal came from Sarah after 5 days of living together, motivated by her recognition that Thomas represented everything she had been searching for in a life partner. Her suggestion was spontaneous, born from a moment of complete happiness and certainty about their compatibility that overcame any practical concerns about social conventions or family expectations. Thomas's acceptance of her proposal was immediate, but serious, suggesting someone who understood the magnitude of their decision while sharing her confidence about their connection. Their courthouse wedding the following day was simple but meaningful, witnessed only by 2 strangers who served as legal witnesses to their commitment. Their wedding night was spent in Sarah's apartment, now officially their shared home, celebrating not just their marriage but their successful escape from the loneliness that had characterized both their lives. Before finding each other, they made plans for their future together: travel, charitable work, and the simple pleasure of building a life based on mutual respect and genuine love, rather than strategic alliance or financial benefit. For 1 perfect week, Sarah experienced the authentic happiness that had eluded her throughout her successful but emotionally empty career. Thomas seemed equally content, his presence in her life appearing to heal whatever wounds had driven him to homelessness while providing him with the security and affection he needed to rebuild his sense of self-worth. But their fairy tale romance was about to be shattered by revelations that would challenge everything Sarah believed about love, trust, and the possibility of authentic connection with someone whose past remained largely mysterious. Sarah Mitchell woke on their 8th day of marriage to find the penthouse apartment eerily quiet, missing the gentle sounds of Thomas making coffee and reading the morning news that had become her favorite way to start each day. The October sunlight streaming through her floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated empty spaces where Thomas's few belongings had been, and the carefully organized simplicity that had characterized their shared domestic life was replaced by a hollow silence that immediately filled Sarah with dread. The first indication of Thomas's disappearance was the absence of his worn leather jacket from the coat closet, followed by the discovery that his 3 books, his spare clothing, and the small canvas bag that contained his most personal possessions had all vanished without a trace. The apartment showed no signs of struggle or hurried departure. Thomas had simply and quietly removed himself from Sarah's life with the same mysterious discretion that had characterized his arrival. Sarah's initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Thomas had mentioned no plans for early morning errands, no appointments or obligations that would require him to leave before she woke. Their previous evening had been spent planning a weekend trip to her family's cottage in the Hamptons, and his enthusiasm for their shared future had seemed genuine and immediate. The note she found propped against the coffee maker was written in Thomas's careful handwriting on hotel stationery, suggesting that he had been planning his departure for some time, despite his apparent contentment with their marriage. The paper felt substantial in Sarah's trembling hands as she began to read words that would shatter her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her husband. The letter began with Thomas's acknowledgement of the pain his disappearance would cause Sarah, followed by his assurance that his love for her had been genuine despite the deception that had characterized their entire relationship. His careful choice of words suggested someone struggling to communicate devastating truth while minimizing emotional damage, an impossible task given the magnitude of his revelation. Thomas's first confession was that his name was not Thomas Anderson but Dr. Thomas Wellington Ashford III, heir to one of Boston's oldest and most prestigious families. His background was not humble professor fallen on hard times, but international fugitive fleeing prosecution for financial crimes that had destroyed countless lives and resulted in multiple suicide attempts by his victims. The homeless persona that had attracted Sarah's compassion was revealed to be an elaborate disguise designed to hide his identity, while he planned his escape from federal authorities who had been pursuing him for over 2 years. His presence in Central Park had not been coincidental, but strategically chosen because wealthy individuals often walked through the area, providing potential targets for the kind of confidence scheme he had perfected over decades of criminal activity. The revelation that devastated Sarah most profoundly was Thomas's admission that their entire relationship had been calculated manipulation designed to gain access to her wealth and resources. His apparent disinterest in her money had been sophisticated reverse psychology, while his philosophical discussions about the meaninglessness of material possessions had been carefully crafted to lower her guard and increase her trust. The intimate details of their courtship were revealed to be elements of a practiced routine that Thomas had used successfully with at least 12 other wealthy women over the past 5 years. His knowledge of literature and philosophy was real, but it had been weaponized as a tool for creating false intimacy with educated, lonely women who craved intellectual connection more than physical attraction. Thomas's letter included specific details about Sarah's personal and financial life that he could only have obtained through systematic surveillance conducted before their first meeting. He had researched her business schedule, her social habits, her previous romantic relationships, and her psychological vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of a professional intelligence operative. The legal implications of their marriage were outlined with chilling precision. Thomas had used their brief union to gain access to Sarah's business accounts, transfer funds to offshore holdings, and establish legal rights that would allow him to claim a substantial portion of her wealth through divorce proceedings, even after disappearing. Their courthouse wedding had not been romantic impulse but calculated theft disguised as love. But the most devastating aspect of Thomas's confession was his description of the psychological techniques he had used to manufacture authentic seeming emotional connection. His gentle approach to physical intimacy, his attentive listening during their conversations, his apparent vulnerability about his past all had been elements of a sophisticated manipulation designed to create the strongest possible emotional attachment in the shortest possible time. The letter revealed that Thomas had been monitoring Sarah's daily routine for weeks before their first meeting, studying her patterns and preferences to engineer their chance encounter in the park. His reading material, his philosophical observations, even his choice of clothing had all been selected to appeal to her specific intellectual and emotional needs. Sarah realized that her instinctive trust in Thomas's authenticity had been expertly exploited by someone who understood exactly how to appeal to intelligent, successful women who had been disappointed by superficial relationships with wealthy men. Her desire for genuine connection had made her vulnerable to manipulation that was far more sophisticated than any crude gold-digging scheme. The financial damage was substantial, but not catastrophic. Thomas had been careful to steal amounts that would not immediately trigger fraud detection systems or force Sarah into bankruptcy. His theft had been designed to be discovered only after he had safely escaped to a country without extradition treaties, maximizing his chances of keeping the stolen funds while minimizing his risk of capture. But the emotional devastation was far more severe than any financial loss. Sarah's ability to trust her own judgment had been shattered by someone whose deception had been so complete that she had voluntarily entered into marriage with her own predator. Every moment of happiness she had experienced during their relationship was revealed to be built on lies, manipulation, and calculated exploitation. The letter's conclusion contained Thomas's most shocking revelation. He was dying from a rare cancer that had been diagnosed shortly before his disappearance from his previous life. His decision to spend his remaining time stealing from wealthy women was motivated not by greed, but by a desire to accumulate resources for the charitable foundation he planned to establish with the proceeds from his crimes. Thomas's final message to Sarah was both apology and justification. He claimed to have genuinely fallen in love with her despite his criminal intentions, and he expressed hope that she would eventually understand his actions as misguided attempt to create something positive from his remaining time alive. His suggestion that she consider their week together as a valuable lesson about authentic connection was particularly cruel given the devastating betrayal it represented. The letter ended with Thomas's promise that he would never contact Sarah again, and his recommendation that she seek therapy to process the trauma of their relationship. His clinical assessment of the psychological damage he had inflicted was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his farewell, demonstrating his complete understanding of the devastation he was causing. Sarah spent the remainder of that day processing the magnitude of her vulnerability and the sophisticated nature of the deception that had captured her heart. The penthouse that had briefly felt like a warm home was restored to its previous status as an elegant prison where authentic human connection seemed impossible to achieve or recognize. The investigation that followed confirmed every detail of Thomas's confession while revealing additional victims whose experiences mirrored Sarah's own. The pattern of his crimes showed someone who had refined his technique through years of practice, becoming increasingly sophisticated in his ability to identify and exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of successful, lonely women. Thomas Wellington. Ashford 3 was never captured, having successfully disappeared into the network of offshore accounts and false identities that had funded his elaborate criminal lifestyle. His victims were left to rebuild their lives while dealing with the psychological aftermath of betrayal that had been designed to be as emotionally devastating as it was financially damaging. Sarah's recovery required months of therapy and the gradual rebuilding of her ability to trust both others and herself. The week of perfect happiness she had experienced with Thomas remained both her most treasured memory and her most painful reminder of how skillfully authentic emotion could be counterfeited by someone with sufficient knowledge and motivation. Handwritten note that had shattered her world remained in Sarah's possession, serving as a reminder that even the most intelligent and successful individuals could be vulnerable to manipulation when their deepest emotional needs were expertly identified and exploited. Her search for authentic love had led instead to the most sophisticated betrayal of her life, leaving her forever changed by the experience of loving someone who had never truly existed.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.